Good evening, and welcome to our Distinguished Speaker Series. It's my pleasure to introduce to you this evening our guest, Mr. Jonathan Reckford. Originally from just down the road, where they wear the wrong color of blue, Jonathan has an incredible passion for helping others to achieve their dreams. Holding an undergraduate degree from UNC, as well as an MBA from the Stanford Graduate School of Business, Jonathan has worn many hats throughout his career. Whether helping to organize the Seoul Olympic Games, managing investments with Goldman Sachs, serving as the executive pastor of a large church, being a board member here at Fuqua's own Center for the Advancement of Social Entrepreneurship, being a husband and a father, or quite literally making dreams come true in the time that he worked at Disney, one theme has stood out very clearly throughout his entire career: outsized impact driven by personal engagement. It's no surprise that Jonathan donned a hard hat in joining the Habitat for Humanity International in 2005 as their CEO. From day one, he has driven himself and Habitat to new frontiers in investing in, serving, and partnering with people to recognize their dream of affordable home ownership. One of the largest charities in America, Habitat is no stranger to the Duke and Fuqua community. For the past 7 years, each incoming Fuqua daytime class has partnered with Habitat to serve the Durham community, contributing approximately 10,000 volunteer hours to build sites right here in our own city. Many of you will fondly recall the fresh blisters, the paint-smeared smiles, and the absolutely exhausted feeling of accomplishment that came at the end of a day on a build site. But even more memorable yet were the inspired and grateful faces of the future homeowners that worked alongside us, literally pouring their sweat equity into realizing their dream of an affordable home. These dreams are the ones that Jonathan now helps others recognize through his leadership in Habitat. Jonathan believes that home ownership not only empowers individuals to become an integral and vibrant member of their community, but more importantly, it allows them to recognize improved health, better education outcomes, and improved income earning opportunities. This is truly the definition of social impact. Please join me tonight in extending a warm welcome to Mr. Jonathan Reckford.
So Jonathan, it's wonderful to have you here, and it's fantastic to see someone who embraces a really inclusive environment, is willing to tolerate both UNC and Duke, both, and work in both communities. One thing that I noticed is you're actually going to be the commencement speaker at UNC this spring, so congratulations. And how cool is it to give the commencement talk at your alma mater?
That is, I was extremely surprised, but it is, as both a faculty kid from Chapel Hill, and I was sitting in the stands just 2 years ago when my son graduated, and so my timing is just slightly off as my daughter will be starting this fall, but it's very special always to come back to this area. And I will. JJ, thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for welcoming Tar Heel in. It is deep in Habitat's roots, which you may not all know. Habitat actually came from its roots were in a small interracial farm in South Georgia that was started in 1942. And if you think about how popular an interracial farm was in South Georgia in 1942, but we built the first interracial community post-apartheid in South Africa. We have built with Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland. We have built with Muslims and Christians in Egypt. We have even had Democrats and Republicans build together. But I think anything is possible because we have had Duke and Carolina athletes out on the build site together. So it just shows you can cross even the most devastating barriers in our society.
So have you thought about that talk at all in terms of like the one thing you want people to remember from that? And is that different from what you want people to remember from today?
I will, I'm still forming, trying to figure out all the details, but I think hopefully you'll hear some very consistent messages, at least from that, and probably less great advice than at least some questions that I hope all of you will think about.
Okay. So let me start with this journey that JJ mentioned, very, very interesting journey. And so coming out of business school, what was interesting was, as I understand it, you chose Stanford because of its focus on public management. and yet you chose to go into the private sector, beginning with Goldman Sachs. Was that your first job out of business school?
Actually, right out of college.
Right out of college, okay.
So I actually had a plan. It didn't last very long. My plan was to go in, I was a political science and English major and was going to go to law school and go into politics. And I came my senior year, having taken the LSAT, to the shocking realization I had no interest in being a lawyer. I just thought that's what you did to get to politics. So I had to come up with a different plan. And in an act of remarkable naivete and hubris, talked my way into a job at Goldman Sachs, despite having never taken any finance or accounting or anything remotely useful, with the idea that I could learn finance faster than those other people could learn how to communicate, and somehow that was going to work okay. And I suffered mightily for that for a couple of years, learned a huge amount, including that I probably wasn't cut out to be an investment banker. And the big pivot year for me was actually pre-business school, when I thought I needed to regain perspective. Goldman was an amazing, place to learn and work, but I was working all the time and not really living a life that looked anything like the life I had pictured in terms of my personal values. And so I applied for a bunch of opportunities to just go regain perspective, and was lucky enough to get a grant from the Henry Luce Foundation, which sends 15 young Americans under the age of 30 to Asia to work for a year. And back then, Asia was very remote and foreign. Now it's our world has shrunk so much. But I ended up setting up a job doing marketing work for the Olympic Organizing Committee, because Seoul was going to host the '88 Olympics, which I was so excited about. I was a big sports nut. And the really shocking part was then they said, I was over there, the stars all lined up. Goldman was lead on the first ever international convertible bond offering for a Korean company. And so they didn't know I was a junior slave, and I was in Seoul and set up the job. And they said, we see all this rowing in your background. We qualify because we're the host country. Would you be willing to coach our rowing team? And I said, no, I'm not qualified, that you don't want me. And they said, no, we're serious. We just fired our Australian rowing coach. And we really, and I thought, I still think this is a really bad idea, but I went back, left Goldman early, went to the U.S. Rowing Coaching College, and the U.S. coaches were not very scared. It's like the Jamaican bobsled team. They were not deeply afraid of the Koreans, and they were very generous. And I spent the summer learning Korean and improving my coaching abilities, and then moved into the training camp with all the Korean coaches and athletes, which just could not have been more different in every conceivable way. And that year really was a year that grounded me in my faith in a whole different level, but also gave me a whole new kind of picture of the world. So that was a long way of coming around to your question, which is I picked Stanford. Back then, as we chatted about, only Stanford and Yale actually thought that you needed professional management of nonprofits, which is now really a very mainstream perspective, but was not at all widely held. And Stanford had a public and nonprofit management program integrated into the business school. So I went there with the idea I wanted to go learn professional management skills to go then take them to some mission to be determined. And I think it's a little different now, but back then I didn't have visibility to a lot of nonprofit career tracks coming out of business school. So my thought was, I'll go learn in the private sector and then port those skills over to a mission that matters. And it was a much more surprising path to that than I anticipated.
Yeah. So you worked for a variety of kind of premium brand companies in the for-profit space. What led you to make the decision to jump from one opportunity to another? This is something that everyone in the room is going to have to figure out. Where do I go? And then how do I make decisions about when I switch?
It was, some were made for me and some I made. And I would say, and I would just preface for you all, everyone has to figure out their own value system. For me, faith drove ultimately most of those decisions, and a sense of, as imperfectly as I could, a sense that God, I'd weigh all the pieces and then look for a sense of where God was really calling. And some of it was quite circumstantial. So I'm not sure I would recommend this, but I look back, my first decision was made for love, not for career. My longtime girlfriend, now wife, was practicing law in Washington, D.C., and I promised, having been in Korea and California that I would attempt to get a job in Washington. So I went to Marriott Corporation because there were very few large companies in the DC metro back then. And if there was one theme, I was really interested in entrepreneurship, but within starting and growing businesses within companies rather than off in a garage, because I think I felt it would be too lonely to go off and do it in a garage for me. And so got to work on a couple of really fun startups at Marriott, their senior care business and their timeshare business, and then got laid off in the '91 recession. So some of you have lived through a more recent terrible recession, but this was the S&L crisis-driven recession, and Marriott nearly went bankrupt because they were holding all these assets for sale, and suddenly the market evaporated overnight. And so got laid off, which is not a terrible experience, and found out I was still hireable, and looked around and ended up at Disney, which is a company I'd always been interested in, but didn't want to move to California, didn't want to go to LA, and my wife didn't want to go to LA, but they created a role in Orlando doing strategy and new businesses for the real estate-based entertainment, and that was one of the most fun jobs in terms of the cool things you got to work on. Now, the Disney culture back then, if you could read a book called The Disney Wars, and the movie studio culture was not at all like the pixie dust of the theme park culture. And an unnamed ex-Disney leader, when I was thinking about career development, gave two quotes that really did not encourage me. One was, well, if you don't come in Saturday, don't bother coming in Sunday. I was thinking, about to start a family. I'm not sure how this is all going to work. And his other quote was, other companies do good cop, bad cop. We do bad cop, antichrist. I'm like, it's like, okay. Now, let me be clear, this is not representative of the company, and I had many people I admired deeply and got to work with there, but it was right as I'm digesting this and thinking about, do we want to move to LA, which would be the next career in Burbank, and a headhunter came out of the blue. And so most of my changes were not sought as much as just showed up, and the pieces seemed to line up. And I would never thought I wanted to be in retail. And Circuit City stores, any of you even remember going to shop at Circuit City? It's all my business credibility is going to go away now, because my next two jobs, I killed both companies, so that's not so encouraging. But but Circuit City was on top of the world back then. It was the #1 stock on the New York Stock Exchange for the 10-year period of the 85 to 95, and it was they had kind of invented big box retailing, and they were about to start something called CarMax, and I thought that was fascinating. It was going to disrupt the car business. So was recruited up. A friend from Amazon, a friend from Marriott was head of strategy, and he was going to become the head of CarMax, and they asked me to take his job as head of strategy, and I just thought that was so interesting. So ended up as an accidental retailer. We moved to Richmond, Virginia, and then in some ways, Circuit City is the only book, if any of you read Jim Collins, which I would actually encourage you to do, that was in Good to Great and How the Mighty Fall.
The sequel, yes.
Yeah, the sequel. And I was there in the Good to Great stage, but the seeds were planted for How the Mighty Fall. And we had teed up the next CarMax, but long, you could read the history. A guy named Wayne Huizenga had duplicated CarMax and had opened up copycats all over the place under the brand of AutoNation. Best Buy, instead of dying, had reinvented itself, and suddenly, though not profitable, had more sales per store than Circuit City. And we had created this third business that was way ahead of its time, very cool technology for video on demand, but it was tied up in big legal and political challenges. So I had to tell the board, we should not do we can't take on another business. And I was just digesting that was my chance to run something, fading away when I got a call again that I wasn't looking for, to be president of another dead retailer called Musicland, that back then was the biggest retailer. Were any of you old enough to go to the mall and buy music on a plastic disc? There were 4 or 5 brands, but Sam Goody was the best known, and then Suncoast Video, which invented the sell-through video business. But it was a chance to have an operating role, which I was really interested in, though it took us to Minnesota, which was a real test of faith for my Georgian wife. And then Best Buy bought Musicland, which was totally unexpected. And so this time it was imposed on me. They put in somebody, so I was a president reporting to a president. That was not a logical long-term scenario. And I thought I actually had stayed in the business world far longer than I had intended at this point. And so didn't follow the advice I usually give to everyone, which is line up your next job before you leave your job, because recruiters always find you more attractive if they can steal you from somebody else. But I walked away with thinking now it's time to go serve, but with no idea exactly what that might look like. And went on a short-term mission trip to India. So Asia's had a big impact on my life. And was serving in rural India alongside the Bungi. And for those of you who are familiar, it's technically illegal, but the Bungi among the Dalits are the absolute bottom of the caste system, or outcasts, where they are literally only allowed to clean up dead animals and hand clean latrines. And then they were not allowed at that time to live in community. And about half the kids were dying by the age of 13. And it just crushed my spirit. And I came back from that. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm going to do something. I want to do something around global poverty issues, and with a sense of deep conviction. Turned down some great business opportunities, and then every door shut. And it was quite painful from an ego perspective. Suddenly, I hadn't had to really look for a job in forever, and interviewed for a fairly wide. I got to the finals of 2 international nonprofit roles, and both times they picked somebody who'd already run an international nonprofit, which is completely rational, and versus taking a chance on me. And then there was just nothing, and it was humbling in a really good way. And went through. I had an unusual non-compete with Best Buy where I couldn't really make money for about 1.5 years, which. So I was a stay-at-home dad and volunteered a whole bunch in the community, and kind of as an act of personal discipline, which is when people say, "What do you do?" which especially for guys, can be too much of our identity. We just say, I'm just hanging out with my kids and trying to figure out what I'm supposed to do, and found some people would just write me off at that point, which was annoying. But I did a lot of deep thinking and reading and praying and a lot of volunteer work. And one of my avocations had been coaching pastors on leadership and helping churches grow. I'd always been interested in how do you grow organizations, and had done a lot of work helping pastors grow their churches. And to my great surprise, this was over 1.5 years after leaving Best Buy, my local church, which had exploded, asked if I would basically come and manage the church and all the pastors and ministry teams, so the senior pastor could really be the spiritual leader of the church, but not have to navigate all of that. It was the last thing I wanted to do. It was not part of my career path. Everybody I trusted for career advice actually said, "Don't do this. It's a bad career move," which was alarming. But as Ashley and I prayed about it, it just seemed like that was what I was supposed to do. And I think I just don't believe in coincidences, but it's so interesting. She's a dear friend now. Almost literally to the day I made the decision, I got a call from one of the big search firms, and it was a chance to run an internet retailer. And I was like, that's a really cool job. I'm going to go work for my local church. And I thought, I will never hear from you again. I'm on the blacklist for the search world. And 2 years later, wasn't looking, and was happily working away at the church. And she called back and was the co-lead of the Habitat search. And same partner who said, "Hey, Jonathan, do you know anybody who might be interested in Habitat for Humanity?" And I remember, just the adrenaline literally went down my back, and I just paused and said, "Does it have to be somebody famous?" And like everyone, I thought Jimmy Carter ran it, so I was very surprised that he was not going to still be in charge. And they said, no, they actually are looking for a different profile. I went home and wrote this very passionate 2-page letter saying, I don't know if I'm the right person, but this is the kind of thing I think I've been being prepared for my whole life. And then, to my great surprise, that unfolded relatively quickly. And that was 2005.
Yeah. So in that in that journey, you had some setbacks. You were laid off. You had doors slammed in your face. How did you maintain your resilience and your sense of optimism about your path in the face of those setbacks?
I think the first one was early enough, and immediately there were enough job opportunities sort of surfacing that it didn't cause, it was surprising, but not angst-inducing. I would say when I came back from India and had a sort of my plan, which was about 6 months of sabbatical and then a really cool job with a great mission that I was going to go do. And when 6 months kind of turned into 9 months, turned into 12 months, that got harder. And I think, what I would say is probably the most important thing is not letting your identity be caught up in your job. What we do is really important, but it is actually secondary. And so, to me, it's, what I really heard, my conversation with God is, hey, God, I thought we had a deal. I was going to give up the business world, and you were going to give me this great nonprofit job, and we were going to go do something great together. And best as imperfectly as I could hear back, what I really heard is, I'm really focused. You need to work on your character first, and then we can talk about, what you're supposed to do. So I think who has to come before what. And I think it's really risky to let I think it matters a lot what we do with our time and how we steward our resources, but it's secondary to to how we live first. And I think I knew that intellectually, but I had to integrate that in a deeper way.
So after a journey in which you did a lot of things in a fairly short amount of time, you've been the CEO of Habitat since 2005, so you've had a 15-year run as CEO. So that's an incredible amount.
I could never keep a job, so this is record territory.
Yeah, that's fantastic. In a world where CEOs don't last that long, you've had real staying power. What keeps you motivated and passionate when you've been in the role over this extended time horizon?
I think when I look back, intellectually, I could get bored easily. I was the worst possible guy to run a retail chain, which is about relentless day-to-day execution, because I loved figuring out the new model, but then I wanted to figure out the next new model or move on. I think for Habitat, one, most importantly, it's a mission that has me consumed. So it's a cause that matters to me. I think the second is it's actually remarkably complicated. So it's intellectually interesting as well as emotionally satisfying. And we've changed so much. So when I joined, we had sort of our big metrics. We were in 103 countries. We had 1,800 US chapters, and we were helping about 125,000 people a year. Last year, we're down, which is painful. We were in 70 countries. We have about 1,240 US affiliates. But we helped 8.7 million people worldwide. And so we have, in a way, the axiom I've used a lot is we should be religious about our principles, but not our tactics. And so there has been so much change, and we've done so many new things that it's never felt old. And then I would say also, over time, my learning curve keeps moving, and my role keeps evolving somewhat as well. So, I had to build a team, and then we've changed, and then kind of rebuild a team, and some of those folks have retired and start again. And then we've very much aligned with the work that Case is doing here, made a pretty gigantic mindset shift to not instead of our traditional work, but to amplify our traditional work by moving in a big way into market development and advocacy. And so in some ways, the role has continued to move along the way as well. But it's, I hold it loosely. I think any day the board could say, it's time for the next leader. But it is also true that, which is an amazing thing, all those jobs I had, I actually really enjoyed each of them. But I always had a sense that they were sort of steps in preparation for something. Whereas since I got to Habitat, there's nothing else I would rather be doing. There are interesting things that come along, but I feel incredibly blessed to be part of something that is doing something that matters.
So there are kind of mind-boggling statistics around the number of houses that have been built and really trying to tackle this issue of affordable housing. But you said something interesting to me earlier today, which is you made a distinction between the hardware of kind of building houses and the software of what it takes to make that happen. And you seem to suggest the software was at least as important, if not more so, than the hardware. Can you elaborate on that software and why you view that to be so important?
Yeah, so it sounds like most of you has everybody volunteered with Habitat? So the overwhelming majority, that's awesome. So thank you. And we've got some professional Habitat folks in the room as well. So nice to see my colleagues here. It is, and what I meant by that is when people think about Habitat, there's the physical output, which are houses. There's the impact we're really trying to have, which is transform lives because people have better housing and the impacts on health and education and things JJ talked about. But I think what is so distinctive in some ways about Habitat is that the center of our mission statement is bringing people together. And I first experienced Habitat when I was working for the Walt Disney Company, and we sponsored 2 houses in Orlando, Florida. And I took my team out, and I knew about Habitat. My wife was from Georgia. We were, donors. We wrote some checks, but I hadn't really experienced it, and I didn't really understand the model either. And when we came out, Disney would spend a fortune on what I would call artificial team building, so that we do ropes courses and all these things, sort of contrived experiences, which were fine. But coming out with my team and spending the day putting siding on a house alongside a family, it turned out the senior people were not the most skilled people on the build site, so it shook up the hierarchy. You had to cooperate to actually do it. In learning new skills and learning them together and figure out how to do things together, it turned out to be by far the most powerful team building thing we had ever done, though we were in fact trying to do something that was helpful to others. And so a bunch of us then started coming back and continuing to volunteer. And I'm actually, it's now public, I've just finished the manuscript for a book that's going to come out this fall called Our Better Angels, and it's about virtues. And our world is becoming so fiercely divided. And when I think about software of Habitat is I've worked in communities all around the world, it's the fact that on the Habitat build site, people who are different in so many ways can come together and do something that actually appeals to their shared values in a way that builds relationship. And I was joking about our dark and light blue divide, though my daughter is really shocked that I could be part of CASE. When I first started, she's like, "You can't do that." I'm like, well, it's not like basketball. Separate from basketball, UNC Duke actually do a lot of good things together. But it is, but I do think, sometime for some of our volunteers, it may be the first time they've actually been in that part of their own community ever, or actually had meaningful interaction with somebody outside their socioeconomic class. And how do we build relationship in a way that creates the opportunity for understanding? And so when I think about software, I do think that in some ways may turn out to be Habitat's deep, lasting contribution more than the physical houses, though we care a great deal about those.
Mm-hmm. So I want to talk a little bit about this book. As I understand it, there are 7 virtues, and each chapter is organized around one of these virtues. So for the benefit of the audience, the 7 virtues are kindness, generosity, community, empowerment, respect, joy, and service. So a couple questions. First, can you explain to me how joy is a virtue as opposed to an emotion? What?
Yeah, it's the best analogy I have is is to think about joy, and there's a theological but practical application of this as well. And maybe I'd start with love. If you think about love can be an emotion, but it's really an action verb, and love is a choice. And actually, I think to me personally, it comes from a passage in Paul's letter to the Philippians, which actually calls us to rejoice in all circumstances. And that's actually a deep idea that we can actually choose to be joyful even in very difficult circumstances. And when we do that, we actually can have an extraordinary impact on other people. So this is sort of the action side of joy and spreading joy versus measuring kind of how life is by how we feel. Our emotions are going to go up and down. but we can, and interestingly, if you choose joy, the same way, if you behave as if you love somebody, you actually will start to love that person over time. And if you choose to rejoice in even the most difficult circumstances, it rewires your brain. The happiness data, the science actually turns out to back it up really well.
Okay, so then next question is, which of these 7 virtues is your favorite? Or are you going to tell me it's like your kids, you can't pick a favorite?
Definitely, it's like some movies like, you can never ask me to choose before my kids. It's like, no, my daughter. I love my daughter. No, it's that is really hard. It is, it might be, I think generosity, and what's tied to is gratitude. I actually think a really wise person said, it's really hard to do something bad when you're feeling grateful. And that, or a monk said that gratitude is the heart of prayer. That if you start with a view of gratitude, then that tends to bleed into all of these other areas. Because often so many of the things, when things go wrong, when leaders fail, it's usually money, sex, or power. But really, those are manifestations of usually pride, and pride usually turns to some sort of emptiness. And when you're feeling grateful, you're less focused on whatever this need or emptiness you're trying to fill is. And it's so heartbreaking to see leaders fail. And I think if we can be in a place of feeling grateful, is far less likely that we will then kind of have external failure in those different ways that they manifest.
So one of the things that you talked about that's so fulfilling for you being involved with Habitat is the real sense of purpose and the importance of that purpose. At the same time, you worked for a variety of for-profit companies before getting there. Did you feel the same sense of purpose in the for-profit world? What are the insights that you've developed around how, as a leader, you can create that sense of purpose and bring people together to accomplish something really outstanding in both the for-profit and nonprofit worlds?
Oh, that's a great question. And I would frame it first that I'm very much pro-business. And I think one of the most incredible things you can ever do for somebody is give them a job that provides them the chance to make contribution and be able to provide for themselves and their loved ones. And so I think we desperately need great business leaders. And the last thing we need is everybody who has great business gifts to leave the business world, because we need strong business leaders and role models. It is, I think for me personally, I feel more of a sense of complete purpose at Habitat than I did in the private sector, but I liked the private sector jobs, and I actually liked the stuff I worked on. I wanted to work for people that did things. I think that retail was probably the hardest, because our job was to get people to buy more stuff, and there were times I was like, maybe they don't need more stuff, even though it's, the part I liked about retail, though, is it's one of the last democratic places where somebody through real hard work and merit, without a blue chip resume and a great education, can still have a great career. And so I really liked the people side of retail and the empowerment side of it. But I think the lines are blurring between, it becomes less, is it for-profit or non-profit, versus are you doing something that you believe in and that matters? And there are a lot of businesses doing great things that matter and creating value out there. So I think it's a very personal thing, and I don't want to apply a value judgment into whether this business is worthy or that business is worthy. But I think the key is, are you working on a mission that captures you and drives you and is both intellectually interesting? I think when I left the business world, it was the hope of merging avocation and vocation. So I had kind of an avocation of helping churches grow and volunteering that really made my heart flutter in one way, and I liked the intellectual and other aspects of the business world because of scale and strategy and complexity that I really enjoyed. And so I was hoping for that merger.
Mm-hmm. So you talked about how one of the things that really motivates you with Habitat is this sense of community building and bringing people together in that community that may not normally coexist or kind of occupy the same kind of spaces. broadly speaking, what advice do you have for business leaders to create that sense of common purpose and kind of working to do something that fulfills the common good in this world that is so polarized and so divisive?
I think it's huge. And increasingly, especially for folks in this room and your sisters and brothers out there, everything we see is they are incredibly hungry for a sense of purpose. And it is my favorite definition of vocation, which I really like, comes from a guy named Frederick Buechner. And he said, your vocation or your calling is that place where the deep gladness of your heart meets the world's great need. Where the deep gladness of your heart meets the world's great need. And that could come in a whole bunch of different ways. But I do think in the language you're hearing from CEOs has really changed in the last decade. And I think more and more are both for their customers and their employees is couched in purpose. And the tricky part is it authentic or is it the equivalent of greenwashing? Or, because now everybody is talking about purpose. But if it's not authentic, I think it's you're more fragile because especially your employees can tell. Do your behaviors and values actually get lived out in the messiness of day to day? But I do think there is more that way, and I think it is very personal. But I do think every business needs to be able to articulate values. And then the hard part is not just articulate the values, because every company has great. I remember when I was working at Best Buy, right before I left, we had our senior management retreat, and the head of HR for Enron was our guest speaker. This is 2001. Well, guess what happened about 6 months after that? Now, what he talked all about was Enron's values. And they look great up on the chart and their balanced scorecard, and how obviously there was some disconnect between what they said and how they actually behaved and led and reinforced and compensated, and all the different ways that you signal or don't signal what really does matter in the organization, as they blew up in spectacular fashion. If you don't know the history, you should go read the history. It was an epical event in some way. I mean, I think it was the equivalent of the college admissions scandal of 2 weeks ago in terms of causing a national conversation. But I think the hard pressure, it's really tough to be especially a public company CEO now. I mean, people come at you from every direction. And so you've got to be both a role model and, a relentless communicator. But people are really looking to, I think, for that integration. And Warren Bennis still has, to me, my favorite model of that sort of three-legged stool of leadership, which is, do you have ambition, competence, and a moral compass? And any 2 out of 3 really don't work. And the worst, actually, is somebody who's competent and ambitious with no moral compass. Those are the destructive achievers that can actually do great harm in the world. And so as we think about, I think, all of you, if you're here in this room, very likely you are both competent and have a fair chunk of ambition, because it takes a lot of work to get to Fuqua. And the harder part is, we were actually talking about it today, is how do universities reinforce your best instincts? It's so personal in terms of how you develop a moral compass, but how do we be intentional of helping people move towards the light?
And as a leader, do you think about that intentionality with your teams, and how do you help people with that?
Yeah, one huge, obviously so much important is, as imperfectly as we do it, you want to hire people that already show up with all three. Pat Lencioni, who I don't like most business writers, but Jim Collins and Pat Lencioni are two that are worth reading. And his are so simple: humble, hungry, and smart. That's kind of a different version of the same three, but it is. So can you hire those people? Can you reinforce? I find where sometimes you fall short is that the values are clear, but it doesn't translate into really clarity about the behaviors, and then holding people accountable for those behaviors. And so it's got to align. And I realized even in Habitat, our values were crystal clear, but in especially nonprofits and even more faith-based nonprofits, everyone's so nice that that can get in the way of clarity. It can get in the way of challenging people on behavior. And so every organization is going to have a mix. We use the internal language of graceful candor. And we've got a whole bunch of people who are nice but not always clear enough. We've got a small number of people who are really clear but not nice enough. Neither of those actually work very well. So how do we get to the point where you can be respectful but really clear? Because it's not nice not to be clear. If you're letting somebody actually behave in a way that is hurting their career and hurting their team, and you don't talk to them about it, that's not nice at all. Yeah. That's actually management malpractice. But it's uncomfortable. And I think when I see leaders being uncomfortable, they're really saying, my comfort is more important than our mission, which is outrageous when you think about it. But that's really what happens all the time in organizations, that it's like, oh, I really should talk to that person about it, but that would be hard. So I'm gonna let it go. Okay, and complain about them.
Yeah, there you go. So I'm going to ask you one more question, then turn it over to the audience for their questions, which is, as you've been on this incredible journey with Habitat, you've faced a constant and evolving set of challenges. What is like the number one challenge that you see as your leadership challenge for the moment?
You know, it's, I'm going to cheat and sort of say two, but they're deeply interrelated. The macro one is, it's amazing to me, though it's maybe starting to change right now because it's so bad, is getting people to care more about affordable housing. And it's kind of shocking. And well, let me do a little test in this room. And if you're comfortable answering it, raise your hand if you grew up in really substandard or poverty housing. And I did. That was just an example. So we got maybe one hand in the room. And I don't want to put anybody in a spot, but this is actually the problem, right? Because most of the people in government leadership positions and corporate leadership positions grew up in good housing, which means they got all the benefits of that, which also means it's not visceral in the way that if we all understand education, we all understand health because we're all impacted by health system, but I don't think it's, bad housing is invisible to a huge swath of the decision makers in our community. And so we have this sort of structural problem of getting people to pay attention or to understand it in a way, which is why we have our volunteers. So I'll do a cheat. No book. This is strategic plan in one page, which will be really hard to see. But the giant kind of mental model switch we did is we want to have impact at the community level, we want to have it at the sector, we want to actually change the way markets work, and we want to have it at the societal level. And so we have 2 million volunteers, which is kind of amazing. But how do we moved our volunteers from a construction strategy to a social change strategy. Because it's really kind of a terrible construction strategy, with deep respect to the amazing skills in this room. It is hiring a bunch of unskilled people to come and build the house, even with great professional supervision, is not the most efficient way to build. But if what you want to do is change hearts, it's actually brilliant. And so if we can pull people in, get them engaged, and educate them about why housing matters, then we can help them. Hopefully they'll become part of changing policies, so that we will have policies that will support affordable housing in communities all over the world and at the local, state, and federal levels, which then allows markets to actually work better for low-income families, because markets don't work well for low-income families. If we can actually change the way that markets work so that low-income families have access to finance, have clear property rights, have access to good quality building materials and skilled masons, which is not true in most of the world, they can actually improve their own housing, which is how we're really scaling. And then if the markets work better, Habitat and other home builders can build lots more houses. And then if we build lots more houses, we'll engage more volunteers. And that's how we have started to scale. So I get really excited about that. That was a cheat. The dilemma of that is our biggest challenge is raising up the caliber of leaders we need all over the world to actually make this happen. Because housing is so local. We are a federated organization, which means the great work is done by Blake and Jennifer and all their wonderful teams and volunteers in local places around this country. Our country programs are a little diverse. We actually directly manage some of those. But I worry so much about, can we, with our limited financial resources, raise up the depth and quality of leaders to get scale in a place like Malawi or in Cambodia, and have it be sustainable, where if we don't lose one heroic leader, we don't take 7 steps backwards in the process. And so having that depth of talent management in a way, at a time where people don't like to invest in the soft stuff because that's overhead. But it's so fundamentally important. So it's sort of changing the way people think about how we build the capacity to do things at serious scale.
Okay, I'm so glad I asked you a question that allowed you to pull out your pocket strategic plan.
I had.
But now
Gotta model
I'm going
that
to
for
turn
our
things
team.
over to the audience.
I had a question on the sort of housing policy that you were just talking about.
Yep.
I think that in terms of housing policy, there is a lot of stuff that sounds good, but that doesn't actually achieve the goal of increasing affordable housing. And that seems to be a lot of what gets passed now by politicians, rather than things that are maybe harder, but that would actually help. How do you see that changing in the political landscape?
Oh, those are two different questions. So what is good and then what's actually going to happen are, I hope we can align against. I think you're right, and it's really complex. And so I think it has to start with accepting this is really complicated, and people have really strong feelings because for many people, their home is their most important asset, financial asset. So they are very protective of it. And otherwise, friendly people get very unfriendly if they think there is any potential threat to their property values. It is, my view is that really complex things have to have multi-sector solutions. And so practically, you can't solve housing without the public sector, private sector, and nonprofit sector. And I would argue the missing thing, I'm a big believer in public-private partnerships, but there's a fourth P that's really critical, which is people. And civil society is an organizing mechanism, but how do you have the voice of the community at the table in a meaningful way? Otherwise, you can end up with fancy, shiny new houses in the wrong places, far from jobs and transportation, and with a big failure. And we've seen that all over I was just in Paraguay and actually saw a really good example where Habitat didn't build the houses, but did all the pre-work with the community to get them to buy into moving out of a flood zone where they were constantly living in horrific conditions, but moved to another place. But there was a whole amount of socialization before the move, a whole amount of work after the move, and a big negotiation in helping giving them voice so that it maximized the opportunity for that change. I think the secret you'll be hearing more about. We're about to do a pretty big, our first ever big national domestic advocacy blitz this summer, and hopefully eventually you'll hear a lot about that. But it's really going to be an umbrella of local campaigns all over the country, along with statewide and federal. But the real action is local because that's where land use is decided, and we need more federal funding. I mean, there are things that are curious. If you're rich, you get federal housing subsidy. We just don't think about that because we get a mortgage interest deduction. If you're really low income and you're lucky, you're one of the 25% who actually get it, you get housing subsidy. If you're all the people who play all the rules and you're in between, you get no housing help, which is a really strange public policy perspective. But we don't think of, those of us who get the mortgage deduction don't think of that as welfare. But we don't, we don't support affordable housing subsidy, which is a contradiction in some ways. And then I think one of the challenges we have to fight through is sometimes we get the community groups fighting against the developers and then saying, well, let's just put it all on the developers to, if we tax the developers enough, that's going to solve and pay for the affordable housing. I'm actually in favor of inclusionary zoning. The best model is mixed income, mixed use development where people can live close to where they work and where there's opportunities for social mobility, better schools. And the data is really clear on that. Getting to that isn't so easy. But I think we need to get the developers and the mayors and the community groups and the banks, all the actors actually sitting together to say rather than incrementally adding some affordable housing, what would it take to actually unleash a meaningful amount of affordable housing? And it's going to take carrots and sticks because the math actually just doesn't work. I have a really smart friend who is all in on affordable housing, has developed a zillion units, for-profit and nonprofit. And you take one of the most favorable environments in North Carolina, it's Durham, relatively affordable, but a lot less affordable than it was 10 years ago and a lot less affordable than 20 years ago. The math just doesn't work as land prices accelerate. So we've got to figure out a model that figures out so the developer can make a fair margin and still make it work. Because you can't tell a developer lose money on every unit and make it up on volume. That's a tough business proposition. And what's happened is we've made it so difficult to build, and I think this is one of those places we could actually find alignment. If we make it easier to build, that could lower the cost. If we give density bonuses, there are different creative things that could make it easier for developers to actually still make a margin. And I think we've got to think about incentives that make it work so the market will start providing more affordable housing, because we have market failure in the US. All the market development stuff I talked about for us, that's all been non-US. And I'm really struck now that we have absolute market failure in the US. There's not a community in the country where a person on minimum wage can afford an apartment on less than 30% of his or her income. So it's broken, and we've got to, we could go way deeper, but thanks for that question.
Hi, thanks so much for being here. Prior to business school, I worked at a nonprofit with a headquarters and then a lot of local offices similar to Habitat, but smaller. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, how do you create standardized practices from your headquarters while also giving autonomy to your local offices?
It is so hard.
Should we get them to answer? Or?
Let's see if we get. It is. I always laugh. You know, that federated organizations are really complex, but it's still the best answer, because I believe passionately that something like community development and housing has to be owned locally in the community. So I'm a big fan. And the big tension then you have to live in is, how do you get all the benefits of that local passion and ownership and the benefits of scale? And essentially, I have no interest in moving away from the local ownership of the Habitat model, but a lot of our conversation is, how do we make it more effective, and how do we help our organizations deepen their impact and help more families, which is what we're all about. And so some of that, if you think about what's the role of the center and what's the role locally, you know, locally, they can raise money, they can manage the families, they can manage the construction, they can manage our retail stores. Most of that is local, but there are things that you can do that amplify the impact of the local organization. So why is it better to be part of, you know, to be Habitat versus Joe's housing organization or Jennifer's housing organization? And, you know, brand, right? There's a collective, huge value. If Habitat were a company, we got it valued last year, our brand would be worth $15.6 billion. It's kind of astounding when you think about it. That would make us one of the 30 most valuable companies in America, which is pretty amazing. So there's a protection of the brand, which is no fun, but really important. How do you hold up your standards and accountability and transparency and trust? And then the other side of that is it creates opportunities. So we can raise national partnerships and global partnerships. We can do things. We can coordinate advocacy at the federal level and at the state level and help provide those opportunities. We can resource. We raise a lot of money for the local chapters. And then we can do training and replication and syndication of good ideas, so that everybody doesn't have to invent it for themselves, that you can share the best practices efficiently. So we're always looking for system ways to make it easier. A big area of growth for us is going to be around mortgage finance and making it easier in our newly complex mortgage world for our small chapters to be able to have conforming loans that could be refinanced and syndicated, and we could open up big pools of capital. And that's something that you can do at a national level that's really hard to do at a local level. But it is. So we're trying to have the best of both worlds, but for anyone who has ever never worked in a federated organization, you will always underestimate how complex it is to actually make that work well. And in all our federations, not in this room, but there are extra grace required members of every federation, and you have to work with those.
There have been a number of for-profit corporations who have announced initiatives recently addressing affordable housing, like Microsoft. And I was curious your thoughts on, you know, how effective these organizations can be in combating the problem, and what the most effective course of action is for them to take. Yeah. So first, I mean, it's great. It is unprecedented, at least for companies to come out and, for $500 million is real. It's too early to tell how effective it will be, but it's actually great that they are signaling, both investing and signaling, which I think is and serious. And what's happened, I think, is it has gotten so bad
that it's a selfish act. Microsoft has realized that they actually can't hire or retain talent because they can't, even at Microsoft salaries, they can't afford to live in Seattle. So that is ultimately a crisis, let alone their service workers or administrative folks or their low and moderate. And so the West Coast has gotten ludicrous. You know, the median one bedroom apartment in San Francisco is now approaching $4,000 a month. You know, if you have 4, young Fuqua grads, that's no problem. You have a family that's making, less than $250,000 a year. That doesn't work. And ultimately, that creates environmental issues. It means people are driving an hour and a half each way, 2 hours each way to get to work, which then is bogging everyone down and shutting down. So there's all these negative aspects. So I think the reason we're finally actually seeing companies talk about it is because they are hearing it so loudly and people are voting with their feet now. They're losing talent or unable to hire talent because you can't afford to live there. And it's a huge challenge. Stanford, I just rolled off the Stanford Business School board. Their biggest challenge is they can't recruit folks to Stanford, as magical a place as that is, because they can't afford to live there. They're actually having to buy up all the houses, and they have a really complex deal of how they provide housing to professors in order to get talent. So I think it's, to me, the key though is that the companies, when they say they do it, then come out and do it in partnership and don't try to sort of create their own housing program, because that's not what they do. How do they support a bigger initiative that would have impact?
I think we have a question back.
So you mentioned humble, hungry, and smart, right? And it seems like, just from what you're saying, that it's pretty hard, even in a talented pool, to find someone who, embodies all of those. And like you said, there are likely a lot of people who are stepping up who fulfill 2 of the 3. And like you said, you want to take the people who have all 3, but it definitely would seem like a waste to just throw away everyone else. So what, in your opinion, can be done to, improve our pool of talented people who, such that, we're getting more people who hit humble, hungry, smart, and, solve that problem?
Yeah, I'm gonna laugh. There's a paradox with humility, right? So as soon as I decide that I am humble, hungry, and smart, I'm not. So so other people would have to actually make that decision, and there's a great trap in that. Wow, I was really humble about that. Well, it's a self-defeating concept. So but I do think we can translate that into behaviors that you hold up and exemplify and really reward. And I think the rubrics are really clear. 80% of the time it's actually recognizing, catching people behaving that way and celebrating it. And then that means 20% of the time you've got to sanction people for not behaving that way. But it is, I think we can all become more humble, more hungry, and more smart. But when you're hiring, that's the best time to actually try to figure that out. Because if, it is, you need all of it, right? If you've got a great moral compass and you are ambitious but incompetent, that doesn't really work well. If you have a great moral compass and you are competent but you have no ambition, that, you really can't compromise on those core values. You can train all kinds of other technical skills and other pieces, but I do think we've got to reinforce at kind of all levels of society good behaviors, because the public examples of not doing that are so devastating. But I do think, part of the humility, C.S. Lewis talks about humility as not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. So it's not being necessarily so self-effacing, it's that it's all about the mission. And you can be really bold and ambitious for the mission, it's for a bigger cause than oneself, and fighting that sort of cult of personality that it's about me. But it is, that's a clumsy answer, but I don't know, my challenge certainly to all of us is or my hope for all of us is that each of you have a friend who loves you enough to hold the mirror up and give you really honest feedback, and who has permission to ask you those really uncomfortable questions, so that we don't kid ourselves. Because if you're here, you're really good at rationalizing and painting and painting a really positive picture, right? All of you have trained to present yourselves in an incredibly professional, impressive way to wow your future employers. And that's good. It's actually a good skill. The danger is if that public persona, if you let a gap enter in between that public persona and sort of what's really going on in your internal life, that's where all the bad stuff starts showing up. So that your job is to relentlessly squeeze the gap so that your inner life and your external life are as tightly integrated as possible. And we all need help in doing that. I don't think any of us are capable of doing it by ourselves.
Fantastic.
Excellent. Well, Jonathan, on behalf of all of us here tonight, just a sincere thank you. I appreciate your encouragement to find something that is intellectually interesting to us and also emotionally satisfying. Your genuine desire just to bring people together, to create a positive impact, to empowering individuals to recognize their inherent and intrinsic worth, and to literally build inclusive communities really does stand out as a shining example to us of how to be a servant and how to be a steward of what we've been given. So thank you. Please accept this small token of our appreciation.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Lord.